Welcome to episode 5 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the book What is Normal, edited by Carroll and Jane Ryan. Welcome to The Reading Cure, the bibliotherapy podcast where we discuss some of the life-changing insights that great books have to offer. I'm Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. So let me begin with a quote from this week's book. Some people find normality comforting, others constraining, mostly both. Do norms provide necessary guidelines to make social life workable and meaningful, or mostly serve the powerful, providing legitimacy for their self-serving purposes? Do norms ensure a modicum of reason and protection from otherwise irrational and even destructive human nature, or squeeze the vitality and authenticity out of bodies and communities? These profound questions are posed by Stephen Seligman, a professor of psychiatry and one of the contributors to this week's book, which is entitled What is Normal? Psychotherapists Explore the Question. This compilation, edited by Carroll and Jane Ryan, is an eclectic collection of responses to the core issue of normality by a diverse range of individuals connected to the field of mental health. With input from psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, academics, and even poets, the contributors to this thought-provoking book offer insights that derive from both their professional and personal lives. Most are sceptical about the notion of normality, and some share personal experiences of oppression and exclusion that have resulted from being perceived as abnormal in some sense. So this is a rich and at times moving compilation, and one that invariably forces the reader to reflect on some of the unconscious beliefs and attitudes they may hold about what it really means to be normal. Now, before we begin our discussion, I just wanted to make you all aware that you can keep up to date with news about upcoming episodes, as well as other content that we produce, such as short videos, by following us on our social media channels. Our Twitter handle is @CureReading, that's with a capital C and capital R. Facebook.com/CureReading will find our Facebook page, and we also have a YouTube channel with all of our episodes and some other content on there. Lastly, for anyone interested in supporting the podcast, you can find links to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee pages at our website, thereadingcure.com. Okay, so I think the first thing we were going to talk about tonight, Alec, was the issue of being normal. There's a nice quote from the editors of this book, Carroll and Jane Ryan, which is that the idea of normality is fraught for many people because they believe they're failing to meet the prescribed standards. So I was curious, first of all, to get your take on why do you think it is that people find the issue of being normal such a compelling one?
Yeah, well, one of the things I'd like to start with is that, this notion of normality, there's two different senses of it in the main. You've got descriptive normality, which is what most people are doing. So it might be 70% of people between 18 and 35 have Netflix. I mean, that's just giving you an idea of what most people do. That's descriptive normality. And then you've got this notion of prescriptive normality, which is what people should be doing. That's what most people should be doing. And I think this is the kind of normality that we are talking about here, is prescriptive normality. So, yeah, for me, I think it is the case that many clients are asking themselves, sometimes consciously, a lot of the time unconsciously, am I normal? Are the things that I'm suffering from, an indication that I'm not normal? So it is a concern on people's minds. And I think probably the fundamental reason why it's a concern is, if we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that one of the key ones is belonging, being part of a community. So if that is one of our key needs, you can see why human beings are very sensitized to the notion of normality, because they're frightened that if they're too different in a negative sense, being weird. I mean, that's a word that young people often use in their sessions, that would be weird, or am I weird for thinking this or feeling this? And weird would be obviously to be positioned out with the community to be not normal and not belonging in any kind of favoured way. So for me anyway, I think that's the main reason, or one of the main reasons why people are concerned about normality, because it's about belonging ultimately.
I think you're spot on there, Alec. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, terms like weird. Most words that we can think of, like odd, or anything that's a kind of synonym for basically not fitting the norm, has a very negative kind of connotation to it. And as you say, the idea that these labels could be put on people, particularly younger people, as you said, this is very unnerving to them. It's interesting, actually, you mentioned Maslow and the need for connection, because this got me thinking actually a little bit about the kind of evolutionary biology view of this. We are these evolved to be these social creatures who, of course, have survived in the ancient past in tribes, and it's like our kind of alarm systems are super sensitive to rejection in that way, rejection from whatever we see our group, our tribe as being, and as you said, obviously this means we have to have this concern with how other people judge us, whether we're seen as weird or strange in any way, and a kind of immediate emotional kind of compelling requirement to try and to deal with that or seem more normal in some way. So
yes, I think that's a very good point to situate in terms of our evolutionary history. If you look at the notion of paranoia, for example, paranoia is to be worried about some eventuality happening that is something that is dire for the person, practically unlivable. So if you're paranoid about something, you have this fear that you could suffer this terrible fate. Now, given that we are wired to be scrutinizing the environment to see how we're doing, how much we're belonging, because to be put on the outskirts would mean originally death.
Yeah.
It's hard not to be paranoid about how much we belong. It's hard not to be paranoid about our normality, because, as you say, our evolutionary past, conditions us to be paranoid about our normality.
Absolutely. And of course, with, again, thinking about the evolutionary viewpoint, that's no more relevant than particularly for younger people. They would have been at that critical point in life of having to essentially earn their place within the tribe, or face rejection if they couldn't find themselves to be useful or acceptable, fitting in, and so on. And of course, that literally would have, in many cases, meant death. There was no prospect really for surviving without that. So it's like there's something kicks in the puberty years, isn't there, where we have this hard wiring to be particularly concerned at that during those kind of critical years, maybe puberty to kind of, I don't know, I mean, it obviously can extend way beyond the mid-20s, but there is a particular period of sensitivity to issues of our normality and our kind of social standing, I think, isn't there?
There is. I mean, you see that with teenagers, that they're tasked with trying to resolve something that is very difficult to pull off, that they want to belong just like anyone else, but they're also tasked with trying to form their own individual identity. So identity becomes such a big issue for teenagers, and that's one of the reasons why they're so worried about normality too, because it's like they're asking on some level, can I develop who I am? Can I form my own identity without being an outcast, without it becoming an issue regarding my belonging? Because to become an individual and belong are somewhat in tension, or they can be in tension with each other. And teenagers are tasked with trying to resolve that. And it's difficult because they don't know too much about life. So it's a bit difficult to resolve that. And that's why they're often so pained about, on the one hand, worrying whether they belong, and on the other hand, worrying if they've got enough of an identity as well.
That's a great point. I mean, I think this is it, isn't it? Not the issue of normality. We have to kind of factor this into the various other things that we're trying to do in the kind of social sphere. But I mean, of course, I think you mentioned the idea of paranoia before. This is important here, isn't it? Because obviously, you know, our reactions to, say, situations where we maybe have a momentary sense of being seen as abnormal, you know, that this is a kind of alarm overreaction that we have here. I wonder, you know, would you say that then that we are, in a sense, overestimating the importance of this issue of normality here? Just perpetually, we're in a state of almost caring too much about it, even though, understandably, we do have to care somewhat about it, and particularly are wired to at a certain age. Are we overemphasising it, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could argue that our obsession with normality is, to some extent, a sign of our own egocentricity. You know, the notion that we're so important to everyone else that they are scrutinising every act, every word, every gesture that we make. People that feel very self-conscious about these things are, unfortunately, overrating their own importance to other people. And there's been quite a lot of psychological experiments that have shown that people aren't really so focused on what others are doing as what you might think. But particularly young people, they feel that they're very important to themselves, naturally, but they then sort of project that out and generalise and think that others are paying attention to them as much as they think. And that's one of the reasons why normality plagues them, or the notion or trying to be normal plagues them so much, because they feel that they're being heavily scrutinised.
It's a good point. I suppose one way that somebody who maybe is suffering from those kind of thoughts could slightly console themselves is that, well, firstly, they could consider, you know, do they judge others in such a, you know, super sensitive, you know, scrutinising way all the time, you know, that such that they might, you know, virtually want to reject somebody on the basis of some kind of abnormal element they see. And of course, most people would say, no, that's not the case. And another consolation people could maybe give themselves could be the idea that even if a friend, you know, or acquaintance noticed something a little bit odd or abnormal, would that really lead the person, if they were a good friend, to want to reject them? You know, that does seem like an awfully extreme response. And again, probably not in most cases, you know, or in terms of if we're talking about, you know, a reasonably good friend or a good person, you know. So it does seem like, as you suggested there, you know, there's something a little bit skewed in the person's kind of worldview going on if they are terribly, you know, fixated on this issue, you know, like they would seem to be awfully maybe exaggerating the degree to which, you know, other people are tuning into them all moments, you know, as if there are just cameras on them all the time, just looking at their every little gesture. You know, it's not quite like that, I guess. So no, and I think this is, if you were a CBT therapist, for example, you would probably put an obsession with normality under the cognitive distortion of personalizing. So seeing events as revolving around you, unnecessarily so. So it is a kind of sign of a narcissism which is to be expected at that stage. Narcissistic in the sense of everything has a direct personal relevance to oneself. And, you know, in terms of ego development psychology, there is the expectation that people grow out of that to some extent as they get older. But young people would be particularly sensitized to that. I think there is a thing, if we don't see it so much in terms of you know, stages of life, that is a big factor in this issue regarding normality, and that's, you know, that we have this superego or inner critic, or as they say in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the big other. I mean, this is something that was mentioned in quite a few of the essays on normality, the big other. Yep. And what this big other is it's not any tangible entity, and yet it is this other person, in a sense, that we've got to please and appease. You know, it is, you know, a container of society's norms and expectations which we have to live up to.
And the more toxic our inner critic is, the more it takes the form of this imperious big other that we've got to please. And one of the problems with that is that we can project that out onto other people. So other people can then seem as though they are personifications of our inner critic or big other as well. Yep. So that's another reason why normality is so compelling as a construct, because being normal is one of the ways to, or trying to be normal is one of the ways to appease that big other or that inner critic. And so
that's a great explanation there, actually, in terms of, as we were just discussing, the clear irrationality of overestimating the degree to which we think we're being scrutinised. But as you say, we're scrutinising ourselves, really, aren't we? We're projecting out this very, very severe punitive superego that many of us unfortunately have, and in some cases don't realise it. And we're thinking that this level of harsh judgment and rejection is coming from the outside when we're actually the ones that are putting it out there. That's really interesting. I mean, I suppose another issue, actually, again, that perhaps maybe more relevant to those at a younger age group, but not exclusively, would be that actually to take a strategic view of the issue of your belonging needs and trying to enhance those. An excessive concern with normality, of course, would lead somebody to try excessively really to blend into the crowd and just kind of follow conventional tastes, which would, of course, make that person potentially less original and maybe less interesting, actually. So, obviously, if somebody can take maybe a less extreme, a less, I guess you could say, neurotic view of normality and how normal they are, they might actually open up the space to develop more, original, idiosyncratic interests, particular tastes that maybe fall out with what is particularly fashionable or within the mainstream at that time. But of course, in terms of their development as a person and their social appeal, might actually be quite a positive enhancement for them, I would say.
Well, yes, I think that's a good point, because when we talk about individuality, it's hard not to invoke the notion of idiosyncrasy to some extent, because it is about being different to something generic. So if we were over concerned about normality, then there is a real danger that we develop this banal self, this generic self, and then we could blend too much into the crowd, that we become invisible in a way. We don't really have any great substance to our personality, and perhaps even little moral integrity. I mean, this is something that Heidegger talked about, the notion of the they, the group, and that people could get lost in that group. He thought that there was a number of existential experiences that ensured, if they were embraced to some extent, that we would become individuals. So things like guilt. Guilt is a way of separating out from the crowd, because no one else can feel your guilt. Also, your mortality as well is a way of singling yourself out from the group and developing an individual self. But the problem is that these experiences are painful. And so in a lot of people, it actually makes them flee into the crowd and get lost in the crowd as a way of avoiding certain existential tasks as an individual.
That's a great point. I mean, I guess there's a trade-off here, really, isn't there, between the kind of, the short-term, I guess, ego, self, you could say, that's having this, desire to, as you maybe avoid pain, feel comfortable, feel socially integrated. And then, the long-term, deeper, more authentic part of the self, which really actually needs time and space to develop interest, to overcome particular emotional issues, as you said, even to the point of confronting really difficult things like our mortality. All of that can't be done if we're just exclusively following the mainstream trends. We're spending our time watching the TV shows that everybody else is watching, or whatever it may be. That's not going to give that real space for, as you said, the kind of individuation.
I mean, exactly. So conformity is not the same as authenticity. I mean, conformity can be achieved by just conforming, by going with the crowd. Yeah. But authenticity you could authentically embrace a value of the crowd, but you have to have an individual identity to own that value.
Well,
really.
yeah.
It's got to be developed. So authenticity is not the same as conformity. Obviously, we've seen in the case of capitalism that it can trick people into thinking if they buy certain things that they've then got an authentic identity, whereas they're just conforming.
Yeah, well, of course, yes, indeed. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? A kind of a, consumerism, will provide us many outlets to supposedly express this individuality, but of course, yeah, if it's just purchasing different shadings of particular brands, then there's nothing terribly individual about that. The moral dimension, which you touched on, I think is kind of interesting as well, though, because obviously, sometimes behaviour that is conventional, normal, isn't necessarily, of course, moral behaviour. It's interesting if you to think about the people like, say, Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King. These guys can't have been terribly concerned with social norms, in the lives that they led. And of course, had they been, that would have been a very, very tragic situation for many people. So yeah. I wonder, that one of the issues that to me kept kind of coming out of this book as I read is that, the various contributors were constantly challenging social norms, for an array of reasons, one of which being, from a moral perspective that, what about those that are almost de facto othered and rejected by mainstream norms due to some particular minority characteristic. So yeah, there was a sense I got from the book that there was a real suspiciousness about social norms. So I guess that my second question really for you, Alec, would be, are they actually desirable at all? Are social norms something that we should just literally have done with and just be individuals, or do you see some value in retaining social norms, at least to some degree? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think what I could say with conviction right off the bat would be that, and this is, as you say, something that came up in essay after essay in that excellent collection, is that so mainstream social norms are problematic. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that they often are connected to ideology, and so almost inevitably they serve dominant power interests. So that is one of the reasons why mainstream social norms are problematic, is that they're not necessarily there to benefit everyone, to say the least. And there usually is some othering involved there. As to whether social norms per se are always problematic, that's a more complicated issue. I'm trying to think about a society that didn't have any social norms. I mean, social norms are a way of ordering our expectations and giving us an idea of how we should treat each other. And you could also say that some moral rules or guidelines are forms of norms too, and I think it would be a mistake to give up them necessarily. Like a norm of that people should be treated equally unless there's special cases. Unless there's exceptional circumstances. I mean, that is a social norm. To give that up would be, I think, quite a bad thing to do. So if you believe in an objective morality, then there's probably going to be some social norms that come from that up to a point. To not have them at all, I don't know how you would structure a society without any social norms. That's what I'm thinking here. But
I completely agree with you. I think, for example, anybody who works in any kind of organisation, if they were to reflect on their average day, they would see, rightly or wrongly, that they would be conforming to all kinds of norms in terms of how they speak, how they dress, how they, what they do and don't say, and so on. There would be an incredible amount of norm shaping would be going on. And one of the contributors, for example, I quite liked the essay by Anne Shearer. She talked about right angles, and she says, we all need right angles to which to refer if our inner and outer structures are to hold. And I agree with you. I mean, the idea, as you say, there are moral, social norms for how we treat each other, and all. There are definitely. I'm not sure we can do without these. So I think that. I mean, I was proposing that question as a bit of a radical alternative.
Yes.
I mean, I do agree with you. I think that there's a sort of stability and predictability to everyday life that comes from norms, many of which are desirable, some of which are not. So obviously, but being able to take for granted at least many of the typical ways that people are likely to respond to us when we do certain things obviously gives us that ability to navigate the social world. So I guess a norm-free world exclusively probably isn't something that's possible. So
no, I think norms are necessary, morally speaking, because for one thing, it ensures that we treat each other with fairness, with respect. Yep. I mean, these are, I think, basic norms. But where it becomes a problem is when you have what you could call totalizing norms. So,
yes, exactly.
In other words, this is the one way to be. And in narrative therapy, they talk about this in terms of dominant narratives. So a society can have, a few, 2 or 3, maybe even less dominant narratives that basically say this is the way everyone should be. That's why they're totalizing, because they're not really looking for exceptions. So in this society, there is this expectation that we should be consuming as much as we can, that we should be making as much money as we can. That's one of the dominant narratives. It might be the dominant narrative, and it's totalizing because obviously it leaves out many people that don't fit that due to circumstance and thankfully inclination as well.
Yep.
So I think when we talk about norms, we want to avoid the totalizing variety, and I think this is one of the reasons why there has been progress, because we have different sectors of society like LGBT people with their norms, and that they have as much a right to have their norms as say the straight group as well. That ensures there's no heteronormativity, or it's one way of combating it, I should say, because there's still overall a tendency to that. I mean, heteronormativity is quite a telling phrase because it's bringing in the notion of the normal, that being straight is normal in that prescriptive sense. And, we're working against that totalizing narrative now.
Absolutely. I mean, just on that specific issue, I thought it was in one of the articles, it was by Meg John Ryan, called Normal Sex. She said that recent surveys show that actually 40% of younger people now would not place themselves in the 100% heterosexual or homosexual category, which is interesting actually in a way, and of course links back to some of Freud's ideas about the fluidity, the non-binary nature of sexuality. So in a way, that's a good instance actually, that maybe the sort of the kind of LGBT communities have highlighted, is that, the norm that was existing there was actually very far away from objective reality in terms of the issue of sexuality, but it was obviously imposed so stringently for such a long time.
Well, it was. I mean, you had the research undertaken by Kinsey in the 30s or 40s in America that proved Freud's intuitions to be correct about how fluid sexuality was, but for ideological reasons, it took a long time for society in general to catch up with that. Our prescriptive norms were not matching our sexual reality there, and that was because the dominant narrative was still encouraging us as a society to see ourselves in a certain way, even if our sexual life was rather different. I mean, Yeah.
I mean, in a way, it's interesting, isn't it, when there were various articles about the issue of kink sexual practices and increasing acceptance of these. You think back to how these kind of practices would be labelled as deviant, and yet domestic violence was not. That form of violence, in that much more, sadistic, harmful way was normal to at least some degree, for in the past. It wasn't something, for example, that police would get involved in, particularly domestic. It would just be left alone. And, of course, a lot of it involved, abuse against women. And that was just, within the broader ideology, as you suggested, that just was the way it was, I guess. I like the point that you were making just previously. I think that's it with norms, isn't it? The idea that they make this kind of claim to universality, which is, the tendency, I suppose, of all of us who maybe feel part of a particular group to just kind of assume this is the right way of doing things. But of course, that inevitably encounters others, and that's the question, isn't it? How do we then respond to encountering people who don't conform to our particular norms, and obviously, as we become more, hopefully, aware of psychology and mental health, and just more morally aware as well, that's something that will be more, I guess, tolerant towards, and will be increasingly, accepting of difference, and not necessarily so quick, to jump to the negative labels of the past, the weird and the odd and so on.
Well, I think exactly, and I think what we're seeing now is a redefinition of normality, that to be different is to be normal, and in a variety of ways. And that's actually true, is it? That thankfully human beings can't just be assigned to one category, and that's just it, that there is individual differences, and for us to lead as fulfilling a life as we can, we have to see difference as normal and to embrace that. And we're getting to the point now, thankfully, where difference is normal, and it isn't to be discounted in this very pejorative, harmful way as deviant, as it was in the past.
I think that's an excellent point, isn't it? Yeah, the word normal. I mean, of course, what it means to be normal is not anything fixed, and in fact, as you said, maybe we've entered an era where normal now does have this much more acceptance of diversity. As that's a normal way for somebody to think now, and of course, not everyone does, but that's the norm now, and that's obviously a very positive development, of course.
Well, it is, and I think how we define normal is very, very important here. I mean, the cultural critic Neil Postman, I like him a lot, and in one of his books he spoke about what he called definition tyranny. And what he meant by this is that we just accept someone's definition of a given phenomenon. He said this was very common, that people freeze when they're confronted with a conventional definition of something. He says, what we should do is ask, well, who's defining it this way? What purposes does it serve? Does this definition actually serve me?
Yeah.
And I think that when it comes to normality, you could see that there's a real pressure by the mainstream powerful groups to define it in a certain way that we should just simply accept. And if we do that, then we capitulate to their idea of normality, which could end up having very injurious consequences for us if we don't fit it. Really, that's the thing. The powerful often have the power to define.
Well, indeed. I mean, this is it, isn't it? It's hard to differentiate issues of, normality from issues of, I guess, social status, achievement within a particular social hierarchy. And of course, we know that's not a level playing field from the outset, So maybe one way that people can, regain a little bit of autonomy in that kind of environment, as you said, is to think more about the definitions and actually, challenge those definitions that are being imposed, in an ideological sense that simply isn't, is to the advantage of somebody else who's already in a more comfortable position, perhaps.
Yes, we have to look at it somewhat skeptically, and see or ask at least, is this something that actually oppresses me, this definition of normality?
Yep.
It might serve one group, but does it actually oppress myself, and that I should not accept that definition?
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I guess, more broadly, when people are engaging in some, activity that's, or have some interest that's, atypical, it's less normal, it's deviant in some way. Maybe it's good. I mean, I was just thinking there, it was reminding me of Durkheim, the famous sociologist who had, viewed these, society, this social system as inevitably this oppressive system to some degree. It has to be, because it organises things along particular roles. But he had a nice quote that was something like, deviance anticipates the morality of the future. And we have to encourage people, to accept a certain amount, I guess, of deviance and difference in themselves, because actually they might be onto something that society hasn't quite caught up on yet. That maybe it will, 10, 20 years down the line, perhaps.
Exactly. I like that quote, and I think it shows how the people that are labelled as deviant, there's an attempt to silence them. So I suppose what we're talking about here is how normality, the notion of normality, could be used to silence people. They are a bit like they're not worth listening to because they're different in this bad way. Who would want to be them? Don't pay attention to them. Instead, follow what we prescribe, what we think is right. So yes, I think that's the thing. The deviant, the so-called deviant, is just a way of trying to silence people that have been harmed by a system, or people that actually even want to improve a system too.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, certainly, this is I'm not a therapist, of course, but this is a tough issue, I can imagine, when you're trying to navigate all of these various complex factors, and I think that comes through very nicely in this volume, all the different aspects to the issue of normality. It's so complex, it's quite a difficult one, really. All of this is in the background when somebody comes and tells you that they feel they're not normal and they don't like it and they want to be fixed, there's a lot of factors to juggle there, I guess.
Well, there is, and there is always the possibility that the client in your room, in your consulting room, sees the points that you're making, could see in ways in which the society at large is a problem, is actually much more the problem than anything going on internally. And yet when they leave that room and rejoin that society, might lose that sense of what you were telling them, what you were helping them with, because that desire to fit in is so strong that it can override even some of our nascent convictions.
One issue that came up in a number of essays was the idea, so for example, Christopher Clulow had a nice quote, which was that however much we want to blend in with the group, very few of us want to be average. And, the word average is obviously a synonym of normal, but, if you ask somebody, particularly in these modern times, would you like to be average? Very few people would actually, of course, assent to that, despite it essentially being another way of stating, do you want to be normal? But obviously average, evokes a kind of sense of dullness, mediocreness, whereas that's really not what people want to be or even feel compelled that they need to be in this day and age. So I guess the question I want to ask was, do we actually all really want to be normal? And if not, what do you think it is that we really want?
Well, I think we want a couple of things. We want to belong, but simultaneously we also want to be recognised and to have self-esteem, which can, in certain cases catapult us into wanting to be very special as well. So it's sort of like both things could be desired, to belong, to be normal, but also to be distinctive in a very good way.
Yes.
Exceptionality is like, is a sort of valued oddness in a way. It's to be exceptional is to be different from the crowd in some ways, but to still be valued. Whereas being weird is obviously not to be part of the crowd, but in a negative way. So I think what you find with people is a need to be normal, to belong, but also a desire, sometimes just as intense, sometimes even more so, to be distinctive, to stand out. What you do see is, as a pattern, is that if somebody struggles to belong, is alienated in some way, then the corresponding desire to stand out can become more intense. So you can see sometimes if someone finds or believes that they're barred from being normal in some sense, then they think that, well, I'm going to be seen by the crowd as another, so I better be this valued other, which is to be special.
Yeah, indeed.
So in answer to the question, I don't think that we do want to be entirely normal, and we're in this delicate balancing act of trying to be important and stand out while also being integrated too.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a bind in a way. I completely agree, because I think, as you say, we want what we don't want is abnormality. That's dangerous. No. That's outcast sort of sense. But on the other hand, we want to stand out in these distinctly socially validated ways. So it's like we want kind of the reassurance of our place is here. But if we can then we can excel, of course, that's appealing. And I think that is a great point you make about the idea that those that maybe do feel that they are already being left out, they're being judged as abnormal. This tendency towards, fantasizing or really desiring specialness, a sort of supreme triumph in some way, can really actually start to fester and become quite a kind of pathological tendency. I mean, it's a grim example, but obviously in a lot of cases, these young people, particularly in the United States, who've gone on shooting sprees and things. Very often it's been the same kind of pattern. That individual has been socially isolated, but has been festering with these kind of fantasies of revenge and or triumph, and just standing out, just being known in some way, and that's led to this these horrific outcomes. So I think that's an interesting point.
Yes, I mean there are ways to stand out without it being destructive like that. I mean, I'm thinking about David Bowie, for example. He was somebody that was much loved for standing out and for embracing his own idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. People loved him for that because he did it through the medium of music and these various roles that he took on over the course of his career. So Bowie was able to achieve that socially validated otherness, which actually large numbers of people could then, embrace, and some might even have felt they could identify with too.
Yeah, I mean, but he's a great example, isn't he? I mean, he obviously made the idea of being eccentric and quite and really challenging actually the norms in terms of dress and behaviour and lifestyle and so on of the day. But used it in such a kind of positive way, that would obviously bring in joy to people with his music.
Well, yes, I think if we compare, and this probably doesn't happen very often, but if we compare David Bowie to say the guy that dressed up as the Joker and shot people at a cinema, I mean, what we see with Bowie is obviously this creativity, this articulation of what people were really feeling, and actually helping us to feel more together in a way, paradoxically, whereas that sort of act of shooting people was just entirely destructive, obviously. But it was I mean, I think what we see with Bowie is more much more creative, life-affirming embracing of difference, really. And it wasn't a vaunting of himself over others in the way that the shooter was, really.
No, I mean, I guess, I mean, again, I suppose if we're thinking about, the sort of, the Maslow perspective, which you touched on before in terms of, our connection needs and our self-esteem needs, obviously somebody terminally lacking in self-esteem, and attempting to compensate for this using more kind of narcissistic ego-boosting strategies could be, destructive in the extreme. But yeah, obviously somebody like Bowie was obviously, there were higher needs being fulfilled in a way that was both boosting his sense of being special, feelings of being, both successful and unique, but also, there was the creativity alongside it, as you said, and the giving something, the higher needs were also activated there, which is obviously such a critical difference. Even again, there is the tension remains between the normality on the one hand, the fitting in and the authenticity and the, the self-esteem on the other, but at least that tension is taking a more, a socially useful shape, to put it mildly.
I think it was. I think in the case of Bowie, what we see is a loving of his difference. It wasn't. He was not coming from a self-hating position, unlike that shooter who hated his difference, and that's why he acted in the way that he did. But with Bowie, he loved his difference, and he was also like a spokesperson for people that felt different, and his music was for them. And so it was motivated more by connecting and communicating with others. So there was more love, much more love involved in it.
Yeah, I guess he's a great example, I suppose, of somebody who, cared enough about normality amongst other things, insofar as you say, obviously he connected with people, he got on with people, but not to a degree that was remotely stifling to his creativity, so in terms of norms that would affect things like his dress and his style of music and other things, they were not norms he was interested in, and good, for the good there.
Yes, yeah, I mean, he was communicating ultimately, he was reaching out through his music, and he was also articulating the pain and the joy of being different, and I think that's why a lot of people loved him a lot. There, and he was also trying to help them triumph over the shame of being different. So, say for example, in that song, Heroes, the shame, when they were kissing at the wall, the shame is on the other side, as he said. This is him, helping people that felt different to triumph, at least for a day, as he would say, over their shame.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great point. I guess, it's true art therapy, musical therapy there, actually, in terms of, the meaning of his songs. Obviously he was that great artist, I guess, that could just express something that people could relate to, particularly those who maybe, similar to himself, felt a little about on the social margins.
Yeah. But I think what we're saying more widely here anyway is that if people are too concerned about normality and they're not cultivating their own difference, then we're not going to have too many creative people, obviously. So
very much.
It is the desire to be special somewhat that drives a lot of creativity, and obviously artists vary in how much they care about normality, and also how much that they embrace a sort of dissociating, alienated specialness too. Absolutely. And actually, that leads me on to something else I was hoping we could discuss here, Alec. A quote that I wanted to bring in here by Susie Orbach, who also contributes in the collection. Yeah. She and this is really on the issue of modern society and how we might be shaped nowadays in terms of the issue of normality and specialness. She describes a tangle of despair that we're in now, in which specialness has been democratised. Now, what I was wondering was, is there something about the society we're in now that is particularly undermining our sense of being normal? Obviously, this sense of, on the one hand, specialness being democratised there, this sense that we all feel an especial degree of pressure in some ways to be more unique, to display more overtly a sense of uniqueness or
talent or whatever it may be. Is there something going wrong in society in this sense that really is affecting our sense of normality? And if so, is there anything really we can or should do about that?
Well, I mean, just off the top of my head, this goes back to something we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that if people feel less connected to each other, there will probably be more an attempt to stand out as a way of trying to transcend that gulf. So if people are more atomistic, you could expect them to try and embrace more the so-called benefits of standing out, to be special. Yeah. And we can see with things like TikTok and so on that people can do videos of themselves and put it on the server and get thousands of views. So it's really encouraging people to stand out in a way. But the problem is if everybody's doing that, or a lot of people are doing it, then you aren't ultimately standing out, really. Course, yeah. So it's a sort of pseudo-fame that they have.
I mean, it reminded me that article and what you're describing there, you know, the famous book by Christopher Lasch, Culture of Narcissism, obviously, which was written prior to some of the, you know, the technological developments and so on that have now kind of combined with this. But I do wonder, whether we've been heading in a kind of narcissistic direction as a society, you know, and now, as you described with things like TikTok and so on, it's so quick and easy in a way to put self-promoting material out there, and there's maybe a sense of normality from doing that, almost a kind of social pressure to be putting that stuff out there. But of course, as you said, how can everybody be exceptional simultaneously? Of course,
I think if you've got a situation where everybody is special in the same way, then it isn't really special.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing, that people are doing those things, but so many are doing it that they're not really standing out. And I mean, it's a good point you made regarding Christopher Lasch, because he wrote that book, The Culture of Narcissism, in the 1970s about American society. And his general point was that as social ties, became, more and more fragmented, and political change was less of a possibility, that what people would do would be that they would turn to their own personal lives, their own inner lives, and they would end up overvaluing them. Mm-hmm. So I suppose in the society that we're in, our personal world is actually our only world. And so presenting that to the world is meant to be a kind of specialness, really.
Yeah, I guess there's a double bind there, really, isn't there? Because on the one hand, we're suffering from the lack of strong, communities that Lasch was obviously, talking about, as having been eroded way back, 70s and earlier. So we have that on the one hand, but also this private world that people have retreated into has now become a very public one, so it's actually being scrutinised and judged very literally, through social media. So people are feeling, neither can rely on the support from maybe strong communities, even strong family links around them, but at the same time feel ever more scrutinised on this self-image that they're having to create.
Well, yes, I think that's a good point. It's like the public and the private are somewhat erased with things like TikTok. And there's actually a psychoanalyst and English professor, Josh Cohen, I think his name is, and he's written a book about this idea that the less of a private life we have, obviously the less rich our individuality is going to be. So one of the problems with social media, which really brings the public space into the private space, is that over time we don't really have that much of things of value to share about ourselves, because really it's all on display. If you make too much of yourself on display, you haven't really cultivated a substantial self. You need a private life, a degree of solitude for that. If you're putting what's happening to you up on social media on a constant basis, then you're not really getting enriched by that experience.
Yeah,
quite
sorry.
impoverished.
I mean, it's diabolical, actually, because, I mean, you mentioned a second ago, the idea that if everybody's having to be special and extraordinary, then, in a sense, nobody is. But, I mean, these social media platforms, there's a level of attention to things like appearance, activities that in the past, really would be reserved for celebrities. It would be for people that were, but of course, if everybody's on camera in some sense, then everybody is having to also presumably dedicate a lot of time and energy to the creation of those images of themselves, and all that goes with that. And as you say, the narration of a life that's been, there's a pressure to try to make seem interesting, unique, but at the same time keeping up with the trends. That seems rather exhausting and torturous. And yeah, where would the space be, as you said, for private growth, quiet, non-interesting activities in terms of enacting them, presenting them, maybe reading a book, thinking about things. But yeah, it doesn't fit too well, and unless, I guess, people are very careful about their, avoiding the traps of getting sucked into, really overuse of social media. There is definitely a thorny path there that people are having to walk, I guess.
Well, I think it is. I mean, things like TikTok, I mean, I've never really looked at it, but based on what I've heard, it's almost like doing an advert of yourself, is it, on a regular basis? So it sort of encourages you to see yourself as some kind of gimmick, doing some kind of eye-catching thing that gains attention. But there isn't it doesn't mean to say that there's going to be much substance to it. I know this sounds awful elitist, but the thing is, if you're going to be spatial, I mean, this is me almost defining what the norms of being spatial. Maybe I should tread with some trepidation really here, but I would have thought that a spatialness that counts in a good way would be one that was connected to some form of substance, rather than some sort of gimmick or really.
Well, I mean, I suppose anybody of exceptional talent, say like a Serena Williams, for example, didn't become the superstar that she is, through, sitting, taking pictures of herself or trying to put out a sort of, a personal PR feed. It had to be done through hard work and pursuing something that was of interest to her, and I mean, I think you're right. I mean, we don't want, as you say, we don't want to be too. It sounds like we're being terribly negative about social media, and of course that people can use it in a perfectly balanced way and avoid some of these dangers. But I don't think that detracts from the fact that there are real dangers here. Where people, when you're putting material out on things like TikTok, obviously you're not, you're putting yourself out there that to be validated or not by predominantly strangers, and at best some acquaintances as well, who, so there's a real problem if people really are, deriving their kind of sense of self-esteem from their social media feeds in terms of how much they're getting validated or not, because obviously that's a very precarious form of social self-esteem, well,
it is. And I think that's a good point about Serena Williams, that if we're saying in general that standing out in a constructive way usually involves a lot of hard work, whereas this social media promise of standing out without much hard work or doing something quite gimmicky isn't really going to, it's hard to invoke the idea of spatialness without also invoking the idea of being memorable in a good way, or the best kind of spatialness. So if thousands upon thousands of people are uploading short videos of themselves, that's not going to be spatial in the constructive sense, because it's not really going to be that memorable, and it doesn't involve hard work. Anybody could do it. I think that's why, it is problematic, the notion of democratizing spatialness, because, I think by definition, it can't be completely democratized.
No, well, that's you're right. I mean, I guess what we get instead is a kind of, very imitative simulation of specialness, pseudo-specialness, which again, it's not clear who that's really good for. It's not really good for people to spend a lot of their time, I guess, watching videos, looking at other people's feeds where they're attempting to promote that, because as we've discussed in previous episodes, that people we're often, unfortunately, will be taken in by good presentation. We'll think that those people really do have the wonderful lives that they're presenting, or whatever it may be. So on the one hand, there's that, there's the danger of that kind of sense of being undermined. And again, there's also, as you said, just the fact that how much is a person cultivating their own unique strengths if they're obviously getting sucked into spending a lot of time producing this kind of very conformist material that's pseudo special, right? It's what other people are doing. It's the compulsion, the sense of needing to join in and avoid being excluded from that activity. But yeah, maybe the price is really quite steep, increasingly so these days for that kind of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we've all got this connection to the big other. We all want it to smile and take pleasure in what we're doing. So if you're making that short video and putting it on social media, it can give you that sense that the world is smiling on you. And that isn't entirely a bad thing. There could be some good feelings that come from that, but it would be wrong to overrate it. And it would be wrong to think that it was any substantial form of celebrity.
A final question, a random question, I thought, could be, in the spirit of deviance and, not conforming to normality. I was wondering, I don't know, is there anything you could share, you can think of that you would say is something that's not normal about yourself, or something not normal that you happen to like or do? I don't know, sorry to put you on the spot, but I wondered if anything came to mind.
Well, I was thinking about this. It turns out very fortunately.
Oh, well,
that I think, for myself, being at school and even uni, being someone that was very intellectually minded, that was seen even at uni sometimes as not normal, or not how most people would want to be. I know it sounds a bit strange, but that's how things have become. Yeah. So at school you would be othered as this brainy person or this nerd or whatever. Not that I was ever called nerd or that, but that's a common term, isn't it? A way of singling out people that are particularly bright, but in a negative way. I can understand why kids do that, because many kids are at school and they're struggling and it's hard going for them, and so they tend to hate people that are doing well at it. I think that's one of the reasons why they're so judgmental. I understand that now. I don't think it was so easy at the time because I didn't see it that way. So yeah, I would say, although this might sound a bit strange, it's probably the degree of intellectual curiosity I have that is not normal, but I see that in a good way. But I think the thing is that at times it is an issue, because you could be talking to someone about a shared interest, and then your level of curiosity or what you've been thinking might go beyond what they've been thinking, and so you could start to feel a bit odd, really. So even a strength can sometimes be a hard thing to accept because of its lack of normality.
Yeah, I think that's nicely put. Yeah, and it's true. I mean, I guess that ties in nicely with what we've been speaking about. The idea that wouldn't it be a terrible shame for somebody to feel that they were not normal because they were intellectually curious, say, and then try to sort of stifle that part of them. That would be such an unfortunate thing,
Well,
so
it would be going very much against their authentic self. It would be a form of living death, actually, to put it in an understated way. I think that's why it's so important to embrace our strengths, even if it's at the risk of not feeling normal, really, because we have to bear in mind that strengths, if they're pronounced, are not normal, and so it's hard to completely embrace them because you're going to feel that you could be singled out in a bad way at times.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
So for yourself, I mean, what
it's a good point. I mean, It's funny actually, because I hadn't considered this question in advance. So my first thoughts, I was thinking of the most mundane alternative to what you were just describing was about the fact that I have a complete aversion to anything like ketchup, mayonnaise, brown sauce, and all the very normal things that people like to put on their chips and things. But to maybe give a slightly less mundane example, I think for me, I'm the way my mind works is that I seem to work through sort of cycles of special interest, where I'll maybe have a topic that I'm extremely into, like, for example, I've loved reading about different personality typing systems, or maybe I'll get into true crime or something like that, and I'll have that kind of desire to really binge in it, and then it will kind of pass and I'll move on, and these things kind of recur in cycles for me. So I think, I've come to the realisation that's not necessarily a very normal way for people's minds to work. They maybe have more kind of consistent interests as opposed to just kind of in this sort of strange hodgepodge way. But that's two ways, one mundane, one less so, that I would consider myself
how
to
do
be
you
abnormal.
feel about the non-mundane example?
How do I feel
about it? Obviously you're saying it's not normal to have intense but changeable interests.
Yeah, I think that I feel okay about it. I think it's something that, for me, it's quite important. I think it feels like really valuable time, to be just, giving yourself the time to explore a real passion. So I think it's important and it's right. I think it maybe it does make me feel a little bit awkward in the way that you described, maybe when you share an interest with somebody who doesn't share that and thinks it's odd to have the interest at all. That can feel a little bit isolating at times, maybe just, having interests that you really, you can share with some people, but with many others, there wouldn't be much interest, and they might think it was a little bit of an odd thing to be spending your time reading about. So sometimes it can be uncomfortable, but I would agree with you. I think it's worth the discomfort to just
I think what we're both saying is that it's hard not to think about these things without the threat of potential isolation or difference. And this is what we were talking about earlier on. We can't think about even positive difference without having to consider how it affects our standing in a group. Really, it's almost impossible not to do that. And that's why maybe, or maybe not maybe, I think that's why it requires courage to embrace your non-normality.
I think you're right. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I mean, there's no getting away from that. You're never going to feel completely comfortable in all, say, social situations about whatever your individual passion is or aspect of yourself. But that doesn't mean that's a negative for you, or it's something you should, quite the opposite. Actually, it's I guess the having the courage to just be yourself, really openly, and
as much as you can be, really. So well, thanks for that, Stephen.
Thank you. I think that was really interesting discussion there again with you. So very much appreciated. And I think we've kind of looked at normality from all angles there. So I think hopefully,
I don't know how normal the conversation was, but I don't think we'll worry about that now.
I don't think we can, or don't think we should. No, absolutely. No. Yeah. Okay. Well, good night.
Okay. Thank you.
Cheers.